was difficult to understand. I think the best description I've ever come across of Russia is actually from Winston Churchill, who described Russia as a riddle wrapped in mystery inside an enigma. And I think, bearing that in mind, we can move on and look at the Russian presidency. Probably gathered I'm hastily playing for time because I forgot to put my dongle in. No smutty titters, thank you. Right, Russia. Thank you. It's not going to work. Okay, so in today's lecture, what I'm going to do is look first of all at the idea that the best way to understand contemporary Russian politics is by looking at its history. Now, this is, of course, is a common approach that I take in all these lectures. But the interesting thing about Russia, it is argued, is that whereas we can discern different regime types, we can discern various ways in which the same regime has manifested itself in the other states, what we see in Russia is a remarkable degree of historical continuity. In particular, this history of what I've called centralized executives. The second thing that I want to look at is the emergence of the modern Russian presidency. Now again, paradoxically, Russia, of all the systems that we're looking at, is the one that has most recently joined the ranks of democracies, in inverted commas. Russia's presidential system really only dates from the mid-1990s, and it emerges in very, very difficult circumstances. And I think this late emergence and the circumstances in which it develops are crucial in understanding this system. So we're going to look at the founder of contemporary presidency, Boris Yeltsin, and then the impact of Vladimir Putin, his successor, who has had a major impact on the evolution of the presidency. Then we look at the presidency's powers and resources. In terms of its powers, there's nothing particularly special about the Russian presidency. If you look at its formal constitutional powers, it's what you would expect. However, what we also have to appreciate is the institutional centrality of the presidency to the wider bureaucracy. That, in a sense, the bureaucracy that surrounds the presidency can be seen as a sort of energizer for the rest of the system. The old Soviet system, the relationship between the party and the Communist Party and the USSR state was sometimes described as like a hand fitting inside a glove. And I think that description, to some degree, matches what we've got now in Russia. And then finally, I want to make some comments about the evolution of executive politics in post-Soviet Russia, because, remember, this system was originally designed, modelled on the French system. It's almost a direct lift. Now, one of the comparative elements that the literature would stress with regard to mixed presidencies, and I think we saw this to some degree in the case of France, that within the mixed presidency as a type, there is an inbuilt tendency for power to flow to the centre, for power to flow to the president. And Russia offers an interesting case study of how this might happen. So let's first of all then begin with the historical legacy. And here I want to suggest that there exists a certain Russian executive style. I suppose we can date this from Peter the Great, late 17th century, early 18th century. Peter the Great, his intention was that Russia had to modernize, it had to westernize, it had to become like its competitors. In this period, Russia's major competitor, believe it or not, was the Swedish Empire. Doesn't think of Swedes having an empire, but they did then. This historical evolution, this model, if you like, of centralized bureaucratic autocracy obviously continues after 1917 with the communist regime, and I suppose reaches its apogee, its high point, with the era of Joseph Stalin, in which power is not only concentrated in the hands of the Communist Party, the power of the Communist Party is concentrated in Stalin's hands. So I think, and Russian specialists I think would agree with this, it is possible to talk about the existence of a Russian executive style. One, as I said, that remains remarkably stable down throughout the years. Let's not forget that the Tsarist regime, which fell in 1917, officially described itself as an autocracy in which all power flowed from the Tsar. So, what is this Russian executive style? What features are we talking about? Well, first and foremost, obviously, we're talking about centralized autocracy. Not just power residing in a single bureaucracy, but often power residing, at least formally, in the hands of a single person. Be this the General Secretary of the Communist Party or the Tsar of all the Russias. Centralized autocracy inevitably brings in its train concentrated decision-making. That the key decision-makers are those in the immediate proximity of the autocrat, the Tsar, the Communist Party General Secretary, whatever. So we have concentrated decision-making in a centralized autocracy. Thirdly, and because Russia, as you'll probably appreciate, is quite a big place, you need something that will transmit orders down into the provinces and which will transmit information back up. Therefore, this is essentially a bureaucratic system. It relies, for its effectiveness, or indeed its ineffectiveness, on the existence of bureaucracy, extending from the centre outwards. And of course, one of the problems with bureaucracy is that the further you get away from the centre, then the more autonomy bureaucrats tend to have. And one of the constant tensions within Russian governance has been to ensure that bureaucrats have as limited a range of autonomy and free decision-making as possible. So, three key points then. Centralised autocracy, concentrated decision-making, reliance on bureaucracy. But these bring in their train a fourth point, which is particularly important considering the period that we are looking at, the period from the mid-1990s onwards, which namely is, historically, the weakness of representative institutions. I say weakness. One could actually, I suppose, replace weakness with non-existence. The first recognisably modern representative body was, the Duma, was created in 1905. And after its creation, the Tsar spent virtually every waking hour trying to work out how to circumvent this body. So the corollary of those first three factors is the historic weakness of representative institutions. So a common observation made about Russia's politics is the powerful historical legacy of strong executive government committed to Russia's modernization in order to compete with the West. In Russian political history, as I said, the executive has always been more developed than the representative bodies when they existence. This suggests the existence of what political scientists would refer to as path dependence. Path dependence. In other words, current conditions are essentially the product of past events and past history. And that despite the impact of people like Peter the Great, despite the fall of the Tsarist autocracy in 1917, despite the Russian Revolution, despite its collapse in 1989 and its replacement by a formally liberal democratic regime, this continuity remains in place. This path has never been seriously disrupted. We have a system then which has never been seriously constrained by representative institutions, a tradition maintained in post-1917 politics with a vengeance. The classic case is Stalin and the Soviet chief executives who based their power on the control of party-state bureaucracies and had massive power at their disposal. Consequently, then, we can conclude, if we wanted to draw this up to the present day, that the presidency, the president, as it currently exists inside Russia, wields hegemonic power. That the president enjoys a personal, uninhibited dominance on federal decision-making, on the political process, and that this extends throughout Russia. In that sense, Russia's previous rulers would have little difficulty in recognizing or feeling familiar with the system created by Boris Yeltsin and then amplified by Vladimir Putin. Now, I said that critical to understanding contemporary politics, we have to understand the conditions in which contemporary politics were given birth. In other words, we have to look at the crisis of the USSR. And these two photos are intended to remind you of a couple of the major issues that the Soviet Union was facing at the end of the 1980s. The Russian invasion of Afghanistan had gone badly wrong. The economy was tanking. It has been estimated that the Russian GDP round about 1988 was probably round about the same size as Belgium's. But of course, Belgium wasn't trying to support large armed forces, a space program, and so on and so forth. So we're talking here about massive economic strain. By the 1980s then, the elite, and they knew this, knew that the Soviet system was stagnating. It was simply not developing. It was not delivering in any way, shape or form to large numbers of its people. The old joke was Russian workers, we pretend to work, they pretend to pay us. This system was stagnating, characterized by these food shortages, absence of consumer goods, and so on and so forth. The failure of the system was symbolized by the failure in Afghanistan. This is sometimes portrayed as the Soviet Union's equivalent of Vietnam. I don't think that's an exact analogy, but I think you get the point, that it imposed an enormous strain on the system and generated a degree of discontent. Remember, Russia, like the United States in Vietnam, Russia in Afghanistan had a largely conscript army. More important, economic failure, represented by these cues. This might have been manageable, but for a fourth factor, which was, of course, the 1980s see the onset of what's sometimes referred to as the Second Cold War. With the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, the massive rearmament of the United States, a determination to confront, to face down the Soviet Union, which generated a huge degree of paranoia on the part of the Soviet leadership. Some of you may have seen Deutschland 83, which is about an event that actually happened, the Able Archer exercise, which the Soviet leadership interpreted as NATO preparing for a preemptive strike on the Soviet Union. People talk about we came close in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. 1983 was probably just as comparable. The intention behind, for example, Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, was to force the Soviet Union to compete with an economy much bigger in size, much more technically advanced. The intention was literally to spend the Soviet system into the ground, and it was a success. Now, politically then, the party elite confronted a major strategic dilemma. How should they respond? Should they reform the system or change the system? And cutting a long story short, this generated an extensive period of internal debating, which led to the emergence of Mikhail Gorbachev, who I'll talk about in a little while, as Communist Party General Secretary in 1985. Gorbachev was different from his immediate predecessors. Yuri Andropov, the former head of the KGB, Konstantin Chernenko, Leonid Brezhnev, all of whom have been dead for about 30 years whilst they were leaders of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was a relatively young man, and he was determined that the stagnation that characterized the system had to be addressed. Fundamental to this was revitalizing the centrally planned, state-controlled economy and introducing an element of market freedoms into economic production. The danger of that, of course, was that once you begin to introduce market freedom, then political freedom can't be far behind, and that posed a threat, clear threat, to the Communist Party's monopoly of political power. Gorbachev offered two main strands of reformist action. Glasnost, openness, which meant essentially making the system more transparent, of devolving power away from the centre, of making the party more responsive to grassroots opinion. Glasnost, accountability. This was associated with, this went hand in hand with perestroika, restructuring the economy, reducing the amount of centralized planning, creating zones of market freedom, particularly in food production, reducing the level of state surveillance and so on and so forth, and introducing an element of accountability, even democracy, in some elements of the system. His intention, it's important to remember, was reform. His intention was to make the existing system work, not change it. And in that sense, Gorbachev found himself on the path that many reformists have found themselves. That reform very quickly becomes pressure for change. One of his most significant changes was to introduce party competition into the elections to the Supreme Soviet, the national parliament. And the reasons why he did this are interesting. Excuse me. Gorbachev could not, by perestroika and glasnost, avoid challenging the major power structures of the Soviet system. Therefore, he hoped to use a more democratically elected parliament as a counterweight to the powerful conservative elements who were resisting his reform efforts. Gorbachev's system, therefore, evolved in a strange way. It had a powerful president, essentially him, in line with that historic tradition that I talked about, but also increasingly assertive and vocal representative institutions. Now, faced by growing national fragmentation, the constituent republics began to demand that they pull away from the Soviet Union and become independent. Faced by growing disquiet from the party-state bureaucracy, which held the levers of power, faced by these, Gorbachev found himself caught in a very, very serious bind. What made this worse were two other things. The free market reforms, as I suggested, very quickly widened into demands for more political freedom, for freedom in the media and so on and so forth, which immediately set alarm bells ringing. At Reykjavik in 1985, the Reykjavik summit, the process began that was to culminate in the end of the Cold War. And the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev expected, would provide him with a huge peace dividend. He would be able to run down the Soviet Union's massive bloated armed forces and transfer scarce resources into the civilian economy. The only problem with this, of course, was that there was a huge entrenched military-industrial complex who simply did not want that to happen. And finally, of course, after 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe, many in the party-state bureaucracy see this as equate perestroika and glasnost, not with reform, but with defeat, that the Soviet Union has lost the Cold War and is now going down into a historic defeat. So, what we have by 1990 then is a political system that is sort of in a halfway house. Still has high levels of authoritarian and concentrated power, but there are rising institutions which are challenging this. Faced by growing fragmentation and opposition, Gorbachev did what all previous executives had done, which was to further concentrate power in his own hands, in the presidency, and then to attack the party-state bureaucracy, of which he was still formally the head. In December 1990, for example, he significantly weakened Parliament's powers over the President. The Prime Minister was made subject to the President. The cumulative effect of these changes were to create a powerful central executive, fine, but also to create powerful institutions, increasingly represented by the Parliament, who were resistant to these changes. This could not last. And this led directly to the 1991 coup, which led to armoured divisions moving into Moscow and being stopped by crowds. From the crowds emerges one Boris Yeltsin, famous clip, it's available on YouTube, of Yeltsin addressing his supporters from a tank, from a loyal unit, encouraging them to resist. And they did. They stopped the coup. Mikhail Gorbachev, at this time, was under arrest in his summer holiday villa in the Crimea, and in effect is released on the say-so of Boris Yeltsin, who is the winner. He is the loser. So the August 1991 coup marks a critical phase in this chain, in this period. The August 1991 coup was engineered by those opposed to Gorbachev's reforms. The coup was supported by the parliament. Gorbachev was arrested. There was debate over whether or not he should be shot, but the non-shooters won out. The plotters failed to arrest Boris Yeltsin, who used loyal police and army units to crush the rebels and release Gorbachev. Key point, from this point onwards, the Soviet system is dead. Immediately after, the Communist Party is declared illegal, and Yeltsin begins to restructure the system. So, let's discuss Boris Yeltsin. Generally seen in the West as a bit of a joke, a bit of an amiable buffoon. Whatever his failings in his latter years, in the early years, he was a figure of world historical importance. And Yeltsin, I think, is a key figure in the making of the contemporary presidency. Now, as you would expect, looking at him, he made his career by rising up through the Communist Party bureaucracy. There was no other way to do it. He began as a party bureaucrat. He rose to the key post of mayor of Moscow, where he developed a reputation for attacking corruption and inefficiency. During the 1980s, he becomes convinced that the system is really dead. It really cannot be reformed. As a result of the coup, he is determined to attack, to sweep away the Soviet legacy. And he has one really powerful resource at his disposal, which really no other politician in this period had. He was democratically elected. It's complicated because you have to understand the political geographical structure of Russia in this transitional period. But, excuse me, in 1991, Yeltsin was the first democratically elected president of the Russian Federation. Not Russia, the Russian Federation, which is the big bit, right? Almost all of it. And as the democratically elected president of the Russian Federation, he was in pole position to take over from Gorbachev and push for the breakup of the Soviet Union. So Yeltsin is interesting because historically you could say that he's the first Russian leader to actually have democratic legitimacy. So he's democratically elected. He was very reformist, at least to begin with. He becomes more conservative, but nonetheless. He was very popular originally. As someone brought up in the way through the political hierarchy, but as he had been, not surprisingly, he has a forceful leadership style. I think we could put it that way. He tended not to brook opposition at all well. But he was also an accomplished political poker player. He was very good at bluffing, very good at pushing a poor hand of cards to its ultimate. And From our perspective, he was convinced that the only system that would work in Russia was a strong presidential system. You see, the re-emergence of the theme. Okay, that's Ruslan Khasbulatov, the Speaker of the Duma, going head-to-head with Boris, and that's the Duma. 1991 to 1993, crucial period. Powerful opposition from conservatives hostile to the reforms continues. Right? The failure of the August 1991 coup didn't solve many problems. In Russian politics, there is an ongoing debate about what the new political structure should look like. And essentially, there were two models. One with a strong prime minister and a weak, largely ceremonial head, the sort of federal German, British type system. Or alternatively, one with a powerful executive president appointing a prime minister. How the decision was taken to go for the second model is a fascinating story which we don't have time to go into today. But needless to say, as you can imagine, it generated an enormous amount of controversy. 1990 to 93 were years of great turmoil, great political uncertainty. Russia has, in this period, both strong presidential and strong parliamentary institutions. Yeltsin was determined to make the presidency dominant. Now, he starts to do this by governing through decrees. Always something to be suspicious about. He uses decree rule to force through what becomes known as shock therapy. This was the speedy transformation of what had been, for 70-odd years, a centrally controlled and managed economy into a liberal free market economy. And not surprisingly, it didn't go well. Not only did this mean a massive attack on the existing structures of economic power, but it also generated very, very high levels of corruption. All sorts of dirty deals were done, and in this period you get the emergence of these powerful, what are known as the oligarchs, most of whom now own most of the Premier League. So, it's not a good time to be a Russian. Very little appears to be going right. There are serious economic problems, serious political problems, and so on and so forth. Ruslan Khasbulatov, the Duma chairman, was increasingly anti-reform and increasingly effective in blocking Yeltsin, who was seeking to create a presidential republic with extensive powers to himself. These two competing models were irreconcilable because they represented incompatible theories of executive authority. Yeltsin narrowly avoids impeachment. He wins the March 1993 referendum on whether or not Russia should have a presidential model. And of course, there are widespread rumours that the result is fiddled. And in September 1993, he breaks the political deadlock by dissolving Parliament and calling new elections. This provokes a second coup, which, again, Yeltsin crushes. The referendum on the Constitution approves the presidential constitution, which is sometimes known as the Yeltsin Constitution. Okay, so by autumn of 1993, there is serious conflict and deadlock. Yeltsin breaks it, essentially, by unconstitutional means. And again, it involves him crushing an attempted military coup. So, the president's powers. As I said, these are not particularly astonishing. Most of them can be found in Chapter 4, Articles 80 to 93. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all. The President is head of state, guarantor of the Constitution, national sovereignty. He has extensive power of appointment to all state institutions and appoints the Prime Minister and therefore can get rid of the Prime Minister. He has the power to dissolve the Duma. He has the power to call referenda. He has the power to introduce draft laws and to sign laws and therefore veto laws by not signing them. He presents an annual address to the Duma. Very importantly, the President, like the French President note, is seen as the national arbitrator, standing above politics, arbitrating disputes between the various organs of state power. Good Soviet phrase that, memorize it. He's responsible for he supervises the conduct of foreign policy, signs treaties, he's the commander-in-chief, and he can impose a state of emergency ruled by decree. Okay, institutionally, these are big powers. It's a powerful office, but you could argue there's nothing here that is massively out of line with what we've seen on previous occasions. What matters, as ever, is not the powers themselves, but the context in which those powers are used and the nature of the person using them. As this is a period of great turmoil, it's not surprising that we see Yeltsin using these powers in a personal way to advance his agenda. Now, Yeltsin, by this time, as I said, is becoming increasingly unpopular. His antics abroad did not endear him to large sections of the Russian elite. A couple of occasions spring to mind. When on a state visit to Germany, he stopped inspecting the troops and engaged in conducting the military band. And the second occasion, when he was on a stopover in Dublin, he was apparently too pissed to get off the plane and meet the Irish president. Now, more seriously, is that despite the approval of the Constitution, Yeltsin's supporters did badly in the subsequent elections. And eventually, he just gave up trying to work with the Duma. He spent his time trying to circumvent it, to get round it. He was increasingly ill, not just from drink, but he was increasingly ill, increasingly ineffective. And he resigns on the 31st of December, 1999, as a very, very much lame duck president. His era was over. His latter years are marked by serious crisis. Between March 1998 and August 1999, he has 5 prime ministers. In August 1998, the ruble collapses, wiping out the savings, the pensions, the bank accounts of millions upon millions of Russians. There were few signs of economic reform working. Lawlessness was growing, and the oligarchs took over more and more of Russia's resources at knockdown prices. In addition to that, the war in Chechnya was going badly. Now, his last prime minister was this guy, Vladimir Putin. Putin was Yeltsin's last prime minister and, in effect, his hand-picked successor. Yeltsin is an ex-KGB officer, designated successor. In the elections in 2000, Putin won easily. The 2000 presidential election in Russia is very interesting. Putin refused to campaign. He was then still prime minister, and his argument, when asked why aren't you campaigning, was on the lines of, I've got more important things to do. He published no manifesto, he refused to debate his opponents, he gave no interviews. But because he was Prime Minister, of course, he was never off television. He won easily. Now, he clearly represented the idea of the strong executive. He ruthlessly exploited his role as Prime Minister, and he won an absolute majority on the first ballot. Russia, like France, has the two-ballot system. The Russian system has never gone to two ballots. The winner always wins by a majority on the first ballot. During his first period in office, under Putin, during his first period in office, there was a notable tightening of central political control over the media and over the electoral process, and to the approval of large numbers of Russians, Putin began a campaign to strip oligarchs of what he regarded, and what probably were, their ill-gotten gains. We make a fundamental mistake if we do not appreciate that Putin is popular with large numbers of his fellow Russians. His argument was that Russia needed what he sometimes refers to as managed democracy. It needed a strong state to overcome its problems. Abroad, Russia had to reassert its national interests. It had to insist on being treated as an equal. And from the very early days, he took a very hard line on terrorism. I think you can begin to see where this is going. Now, something else that's important to note about Putin's presidency. Yeltsin, when he was president, created a sort of Russian equivalent of the West Wing, a sort of personal presidential bureaucracy. Under Putin, this was reorganized and beefed up. The presidential executive office is, if you remember, I use the analogy of the hand in the glove. It's a critical arm of presidential authority. And it's fascinating. I haven't got time to talk about it in any great detail, but this slide gives you some idea of its scale. It's run by a chief of the presidential administration. It involves presidential envoys to the federal districts. It has a member on the federal council. It has formal representation in the State Duma. It has a member on the Constitutional Court. It has 20 directorates. For example, the Presidential Chancellery, the Security Council, the Advisor's Office, the State Legal Directorate, Domestic Policy, Foreign Policy, Personnel, Civil Service, Citizens' Constitutional Rights, Communication and Public Feedback, Press and Information, blah, 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 blah. This is an incredibly important and powerful bureaucracy, recognized as such by all other bureaucrats as being the personal extension of presidential authority. So if you get a call from the presidential executive office, in effect, it's a call from Vladimir Putin. And this is crucial to understanding how the system works. Under Putin, it is generally accepted that there has been a deepening of authoritarian tendencies, albeit ones consistently approved of by the electorate, albeit with some fiddling. A process of democratic rollback has been underway. The executive now has effective control over the media. Election rules have been used to weaken opposition parties and neutralise opposition candidates. Possible competitors for power have been subject to arrest, imprisonment, and, it has been claimed, state-sponsored assassination. In other words, already weak checks on executive power have been further eroded. The result has been a shift from managed democracy to what has been described as bureaucratic dictatorship. But note, it rests on electoral approval. I haven't got time to go into these in any great detail. This gives you the State Duma elections for December 2011. All of these parties were approved by the Central Election Commission. United Russia essentially is the presidential party, although it's only recently that Putin has graciously acknowledged that this is in effect his party. As you can see, some of these, we've tried that, didn't work. The Liberal Democratic Party is neither liberal nor democratic. A Just Russia only just managed to squeeze in. A crucial point is this, I'll just mention this. A majority in the Duma is 226. If you get two-thirds, 301, in effect, you can change the constitution without a referendum. You just pass the law. That's crucially important. Crucially important. This is the March 2012 presidential election. As you can see, a huge plurality for Putin. No one comes within spitting distance. This is an interesting election. Some American political scientists have done some calculations. There's widespread recognition, acceptance, that this was fiddled. They did some calculations which suggested that if it hadn't been fiddled, Putin would still have won by something like 58 to 60%. In other words, it's a bit like Watergate. It was unnecessary. The point I'm trying to make, however, is that Putin still feels it necessary to have elections. Okay. So Putin is increasing, he's a judo expert, by the way, which I should imagine goes down a bundle in international negotiations. Putin has been described as a democratic czar, and he enjoys substantial support for what he does. Many Russians, remember, were scarred by the 1990s. If I'd gone through what most Russians had gone through in the 1990s, I think I'd vote for Putin, to be honest. There is a strong cultural loyalty, cultural support for strong leaders. You know, like the old joke that Brezhnev and the Politburo get a medium to contact Stalin and say, you know, will you come back, Joseph, to sort the Soviet Union out? And Stalin takes some persuading, but he says, eventually, yes, I'll come back, but this time only on one condition. What's that? This time, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Managed democracy. The system has to be based on democratic legitimacy, but it can't be allowed to run riot. It has to be carefully controlled, carefully managed. It's built upon bureaucratic authoritarianism. Why? Well, the answer should be obvious. Tradition and habit, path dependence, historical institutionalism, the need for the president, Putin, to force through radical change, to maintain order, and to counter fragmentation. A powerful fear amongst the Russian political elite is of fragmentation, and they are determined to counter it. This, it is argued, has given rise to what is referred to sometimes as the Russian model, or super presidentialism. And one of the leading students of this, Anna Shvetsova, describes it in these terms. What Russian political engineers took was the external attributes of liberal democracy, guaranteeing strong presidential power, but the checks and balances were pushed to one side. Okay? Strong executive power, but weak checks and balances. So we have a system then, the contours of super-presidentialism are quite clear. Direct presidential election, the neutralization of opposition, a broad-based party, United Russia, to control the Duma, the manipulation and control of the media, the centralization of power in the presidency, and, if necessary, the destruction of rivals. The destruction of rivals, potential competitors for power. That is seen as being the contours of super-presidentialism. This is Dmitry Medvedev, who is the Prime Minister, and when Putin had completed his first 2 terms in office, he loyally stepped in to keep the seat warm of President, whilst Putin did a turn as Prime Minister, and he was then re-elected President. So what we see then is from these, a system that all previous Russian chief executives would recognize. The only thing that they would find a bit strange is the necessity to keep having elections. But the rest of it seems to fit almost exactly the history of Russian executive politics. Now, final word. Putin's not going to live forever. Well, I don't know, he may do, but let's assume he isn't. What happens next? One of the most serious problems that any political system faces, where power is concentrated in one or a few hands, is the problem of succession. What will happen when Putin goes? Has this system been institutionalized to a degree that can ensure its own survival? We shall see. Thank you.